Good evening. Thank you very much for coming along to the McFarlane Hall on a Friday evening nonetheless. My name is Calum Kerr. I am the chair of Yes Scottish Borders, and our objective over the coming months in the run-up to the referendum is to organise a series of events to give you perspectives. We all face the biggest vote we will ever cast in our whole life. The biggest vote that's been cast in the history of this nation. Because 300 years ago, at the Act of Union, nobody got a vote. And the objective of Yes Scottish Borders is to give you perspectives. So over the coming months, you will have an event with Patrick Harvey and the Greens, which will be at the end of July. We will have Business for Scotland, with a perspective on the business case, the raw numbers of independence. We'll have Women for Independence to give their perspective. And we'd like to hear from you tonight as well. If anybody has any other group that you would really like to hear from over the coming months, let us know, because we are very busy organising lots of events. Now tonight we have another perspective altogether, and I'm delighted to welcome Wealthy Nation here to Peebles tonight. And I will try desperately, Michael, not to steal your thunder, because I still want to tell everyone about it. But what I will say is we have a fantastic panel for you. We have asked each of them to speak for up to 10 minutes. I have been warned one or two of them may go on. I will hook them down if they go on too long. You have on your seats a question form. Now that is not the only way we will take questions tonight. We will open it to the floor if anyone would like to ask questions, but I would ask you to save them until after everyone has spoken. So either write it down or put your hand up when I ask for questions. We will collect them after everyone has spoken. Now, first of all, we have to speak tonight Michael Fry, who many of you may know. He's an historian, economic journalist, and he is actually the founder of Wealthy Nation. He's committed to changing the long-term future of Scotland into a productive, economically liberal and free nation. A new Scotland enriched and enabled to generate wealth. Michael Fry.
Thank you. Well, it's very nice to be here, and thank you all for turning out on a rainy Friday night. We formed Wealthy Nation because we felt very strongly that the decision on September the 18th has to involve all the people of Scotland and all sections of Scottish society. We hope that after September the 18th we will have a new nation, looking forward to a new future and a new destiny. And we are very strongly of the opinion that that victory on September the 18th should not be a victory for one section of the nation, for one social class, for one region of the nation. It should involve all of us. Obviously, a considerable minority is going to vote no anyway, but we are very anxious that the yes side should not present the appearance in these 3 months of the coming campaign of being monolithic, of just spouting an orthodoxy. Now, we recognise, obviously, this referendum is essentially going to be won in the west of Scotland. I mean, that's where more than half the population lives, and it has political interests of its own, and it's inevitable that the main burden of the campaign is going to be fought over that ground. But that makes it seem to us all the more important that all the other strands in the nation should make their voices heard. I mean, Scotland, for its small size, is an extremely diverse nation. As somebody said, it's a combination of Belgium and Norway, derelict industrial land, and then people living in bliss amid the mountains and loss. So our part in this is to remind everyone that Scottish independence is not simply a left-wing cause. It's not something which only left-wing people can support, and we hope it will bring results that do more than satisfy merely the left-wing in Scottish politics. We chose the name Wealthy Nation, first of all, because we wanted to join that part of the campaign which counters the argument from the no side that Scotland is too poor, too wee, and too stupid to be an independent country. On the contrary, the others will deal with all the figures, but I mean, I believe we're the 17th richest nation in the world. We're certainly, we have 5 of the finest universities in the world, an incredible achievement for such a small country. And we certainly have everything it takes to be an independent nation if it is our will to do so. So that was the first reason we chose the name Wealthy Nation. And the other big reason is, of course, it's a very clear allusion to Adam Smith, the founder of the modern science of economics, and his book published in 1776, his great book called The Wealth of Nations, which investigated how nations become wealthy and how they should deploy their wealth once they've achieved that. Now, in the last, let's say, since 1979, Adam Smith has acquired a rather bad reputation, not least in Scotland, as being the architect of capitalism and all the evils supposed to be attendant on that. But if you read Adam Smith, if you actually read the text, Adam Smith is actually in favour of the ordinary man, of the ordinary person. One of the strongest lines that comes across in Adam Smith, he says that merchants, by which he means business people, are in a constant conspiracy to defraud the public and enrich themselves at the public's expense. And he says the answer to this inborn tendency, this ingrained tendency in the business community, is to make the general people of the country as free as they possibly can be, to give them the rights which enable them to resist the pressures of business. So that's the side of Adam Smith that we want to emphasise in our campaign, that Adam Smith is actually a man of the people, and he defends the people's rights. What we would say in the present situation that we face in Scotland, we are absolutely sure that after independence, Scotland can become a country in which all its citizens are freer and happier people. But I think we would probably disagree with certain other sections of the independence movement if we say that we shouldn't see the opportunities after we become an independent country as merely being a process by which we share out the wealth that becomes available to us, under the North Sea or whatever it may be. What we have to do is to look to the future and to continue to generate and increase that wealth. So the first thing we have to do, before we come to the share out, we should make sure that we have deployed our wealth in order to increase our growth rate, because Scotland has had, inside the United Kingdom, an underperforming economy with rather a poor growth rate. I mean, we're often compared, for example, or we like to compare ourselves with the Scandinavian countries and say we could be like that after independence. But the Scandinavian countries routinely achieve a growth rate every year of 4%. This year in Scotland, in a phase of strong recovery from recession, we're only going to achieve a growth rate of 2.5%. So we have a long way to go before we attain the level of national income and national prosperity that allows us to have the kind of social services and social provision that the Scandinavian countries enjoy. So the main purpose of Wealthy Nation, I would say, that as it's emerged from our campaigning so far, is that we have to convince the people of Scotland that that is the necessity we face, the first item on the agenda. We're also absolutely sure that this first item on the agenda can only be fulfilled if we have an independent country with full powers over our own economic fate. Now, my remarks are just by way of introduction. I have colleagues here who are extremely expert on the more detailed aspects of what I've been saying. So, I look forward to sharing the rest of the evening with you, and I hand over now to my colleague, who will be introduced by Calum.
Thank you, Michael. It's interesting, one stat I heard, and I apologise if you're going to use this, but I heard the Scottish Cabinet was in Selkirk this week, and Salmond was asked for one stat that he thought highlighted the differences between Scotland and other nations. And he said, one stat, in the whole of the 20th century, the Scottish population increased by only 10%. In England, it was 60%. Now, our next speaker tonight is Eben Wilson. Eben is the Director of Taxpayer Scotland, a political economist and returnee global Scot, with an early career in media and latterly in technical industries, staunch advocate for low taxes and constrained government spending. Eben Wilson.
I'll stand up. I'm sorry you're going to have to be addressed by at least two economists tonight, because we've had 2 years of economics in this argument. I'm not going to give you some economics, because lucky me, I'm a political economist, and I went to St Andrews at the same time as Alex Salmond, and more about behaviour, so I want to talk about people a little. If you boil this argument down, for me, you have to look at the way the world has gone and the world is now changing. We have a new world. The new world involves free trade, largely global. I've been around the world in my life and I've seen this free trade at work. We also have things called governments. Let's put it what a government is. That's the government, the quangos, the bureaucracy and all the larger things that tax us all, but to be generally getting larger and larger. As they've got larger and larger, our economies in the developed Western world generally have become more brittle. The 2008 problem that we all had wasn't just in Britain. It was in every European country. It was in America and various other places in the world, not so much in Asia, we can discuss that if you want, but in Australia. But what actually I think this referendum debate boils down to is, where do you want governance to be? And who do you want it to be done by? And if you are a Scot in Scotland, there is only one place that you want your government to be. In Scotland, for Scots, to make Scotland get what it wants as a democratic idea. I have become convinced of that. I am the son of an engineer, who was the son of an engineer, who was the son of an engineer, who was the son of a drayman. On my mother's side, I was a daughter of a maths teacher, who was daughter of a head teacher, who was the daughter of a dry-stained dyker. We have come on and we've all managed to do things. And we can do it again and we can continue to do it if we are allowed to be free enough to build the capital, build the knowledge, and get on with things, because we have the go. One of the issues I'll put in a personal context. I have a niece who is in Auckland, New Zealand, who's an immunologist from the University of Edinburgh. I have a nephew who's a brewer. He's in Illinois. I have another niece. She's a parasitologist. She's in Malawi, wearing welly boots in a river. I have a son. He's in London. He's an engineer. He's just helped build an oil rig that is going into the sea off the west of Shetland. It cost $4.5 billion. It was made in Korea. We have to try and change this. You can't do it by building big industries straight out the box. We have to start at the bottom We have to start with liberality. We have to start with low tax rates. We have to start with localising our government. That's localising it beyond and below Hollywood. We have to allow the people the liberty to make capital, build knowledge, and move on. And that's what Wealthy Nation is trying to put forward as part of the referendum debate. I'm going to stop there, because otherwise we'll get into technicalities of how you do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our third speaker tonight is Professor David Simpson, founder of the Fraser of Allander Insitute in 1975 and Professor of Economics at the University of Strathclyde from 1975 until 1988, formerly Economic Advisor to Standard Life and Vice Chairman of the Water Industry Commission for Scotland. David Simpson.
Well, as you will gather from that introduction, ladies and gentlemen, I spent a large part of my life as an academic, and I haven't been able to throw off entirely the bad habits that you pick up in that particular line of work. So forgive me if you find me a little bit boring from time to time, and I'll try to follow Eben's good example and sit down fairly quickly. And because I'm an economist, I've often been called upon to answer the economic questions that are often thrown at us by the No campaign. You'll probably have noticed that the No campaign likes to specialise in negativity, and in particularly negativity in economic issues, and they will tell you all kinds of wonderful statistics and numbers relating to, for example, the supposed deficit that an independent Scotland might suffer in the first few years of its existence. That's to say, government budget deficit. And they'll even put numbers in that. Now, of course, right away you can see that that's nonsense, because none of us know. I certainly don't know, and they don't know such simple things as where is the stock market going to be in 12 months' time? What is the level of interest rates going to be in 12 months' time? What is the exchange rate between the pound and the euro going to be in 12 months' time? We just simply don't know. And if anybody tries to tell you that they do know, please don't believe them. Now, I want to try tonight to get away from economics and get away from negativity, but before I do, I can't resist the temptation of getting in a little retribution against Danny Alexander, who seems to be one of the worst culprits in terms of coming up with preposterous numbers. I saw the other day that he had caused to be produced a Treasury paper which claimed that the start-up costs of the government of an independent Scotland would be 2.7 billion. That was an amazingly accurate number, which he justified by quoting from the work of a Professor Dunleavy of the London School of Economics, who immediately tweeted that this was bizarrely inaccurate and that in fact he thought the number would be closer to 200 million. And when pressed on this, the permanent secretary to the Treasury, Sir Nicholas Macpherson, went as far as to say that he accepted that they had misbriefed. Wonderful word. Misbriefed. It reminds me of another permanent secretary of the Treasury a few years ago who admitted that he had been economical with the truth. Anyway, the funny thing is that it may be not surprising that after this mistakes by an order of magnitude of 10, that Danny Alexander and his friend George Osborne have made such a mess of the public finances. You may remember that in May 2010, when the Conservative government came to power at Westminster, they pledged themselves to clearing up the mess that they'd inherited from Labour, that they were going to put the public finances on a sound footing. Well, in fact, what has happened in the 4 years since then is that George Osborne and Danny Alexander have succeeded in adding £700 billion to the national debt, the UK national debt, £700 billion. in that space of time, they have added more to the UK national debt than Brown and Darling managed in the previous 11 years of Labour government. That's not a statistic that you often hear mentioned, and that, unlike forecasts about what might happen in the future, that is a hard fact because it is something that's already recorded as having happened in the past. Now, the national debt has not stopped rising. In fact, the OBR is saying that it will go on rising until at least 2018, 2019, by which time it will have reached 1.5 trillion pounds sterling. That's to say 1,500 billion pounds. Now, I think you can appreciate that when you're talking at that level, we're talking about real money here. And you might think these are just figures that appear in the Treasury's accounts, and that they don't have any real-world significance. Well, let me tell you this, that the interest that is paid by the British government on that debt of now approaching 1.5 trillion pounds sterling, at the very, very low rates of interest which they're paying at the moment, which will not last much beyond the next election, that interest cost is greater than the whole of the UK defence budget. And so that gives you an idea of the real cost of having such a large national debt. Now, I want to drop the negativity a bit there, but without leaving economics, let me say why I have some reason to be confident that an independent Scotland will be a wealthy nation, as Michael outlined. First of all, although we can't predict the future in detail, in numbers, and as I say, anybody who tries to, you shouldn't believe them, we can have some confidence in what I would call pattern predictions. It's a bit like weather forecasting. You heard the old story that economic forecasting was invented to make weather forecasting look respectable. Well, there is some parallel between the two things, and that is this, that although we all know from painful experience that particular weather forecasts, like how the weather will be tomorrow in Peebles, whether it will rain, what the temperature will be, can't be relied on exactly. So, for example, nobody would be able to say that next Christmas Day it will be snowing here in Peebles. You could make a bet about it, but you couldn't make a scientific statement about it. But what you can say, with a considerable degree of scientific backing, is that there is a much greater probability of snow falling here in Peebles next Christmas Day than there is next Midsummer's Day. In other words, the pattern of behaviour in the weather is more predictable in individual items of detail, and it's exactly the same with economics. We don't know when the next recession will be, and we don't know how big it will be, but we do know for sure from historical evidence that there will be another recession. And likewise, the pattern that I take comfort from is that the historical evidence shows that over the last many, many decades, smaller Western European countries have been much better off than their larger counterparts. And that pattern shows no sign of changing, and it is backed up by any amount of statistical testing. We also know from historical experience that when countries become independent, like Norway did when it became independent from Sweden 100 years ago, or when Ireland became independent from the UK in 1922, or when Slovakia became independent just a few years ago from Czechoslovakia as a whole, or indeed in the case of all the countries that left the British Empire in the decades after 1950. The one pattern that is very, very clear is that none of them have ever wanted to go back. In other words, none of them have ever regretted that decision. Even in the case, you might think of a few years ago when Ireland was in the travails of its own calamitous fall in output and employment after 2008, there was nobody in that country said, oh, we've made a mistake, we really should go back and have our economic affairs run by Westminster. No one thought that. And that's not just the case of Ireland, it's the case of, as I say, all these countries which have become independent. They have discovered that they actually really are better off when they run their own affairs. So much for economics, because I want to emphasize that I don't believe that the case for independence has anything to do with economics. I think it's a political and a moral case. And I think that the case is based on the fact that the opposite of independence is dependence. And if there is one thing which is corrosive of not only of individual behavior, but also of societal behavior, it is permanent dependence of one country on another. It is the attitude which says, rather than earning our own living, we should accept pocket money or dole money from somebody else. And that, I think, is an utterly destructive attitude, both so far as individuals are concerned and so far as nations are concerned. Now, the Labour Party makes no bones about the fact that they believe exactly the opposite. I have heard them say on television that they think we should continue to be subsidised by the southeast of England, as they see it, forgetting conveniently that we, in fact, have been subsidising England for decades through the North Sea oil. And this is really the philosophy of the begging bowl, or you might say the cargo cult. Only nowadays, since the word subsidy is becoming increasingly unfashionable, they've taken to calling them transfers, or even more recently, the unionist dividend, or the dividend of the union. That's what they call it. So I believe personally that responsibility and self-reliance are virtues that are just as important for societies as they are for individuals. I just want to close by saying that there are two other arguments, I believe, political arguments for independence, which I think are difficult to gainsay. And the first of those is that independence would guarantee that we would get the government that we voted for. Now, it may turn out that that may not be the government that we like at the end of the day, but it's certainly the one that we voted for. And that surely is what democracy means.
Yeah.
Thank you. The second undeniable benefit of independence is that we should have a place at the top table in international affairs, whether that be NATO, the EU, or any of the United Nations organizations. And it's at these levels, increasingly, that the important decisions that directly and indirectly affect all our lives are made. If we don't have a seat at the top table, no one is going to listen to us. And I think it's particularly important that we should be able to make our own decisions about foreign affairs and about defense. The disastrous consequences of the two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which we have just lost, have been spelled out in a recent paper from the Royal United Services Institution and reiterated only the other day by Lord Richards, former Chief of the Defence Staff. And amongst the many dire consequences of these wars, they point out, quite correctly, that the young British Muslims have been radicalized by these events, by our invasion of Iraq and our invasion of Afghanistan, to say nothing of our policies in other parts of the Middle East. Now, if you listen to the establishment view, the view of the British political class, Labour and Tories, they will tell you that these young British Muslims who have gone off to fight for these appalling terrorist groups have been radicalized by listening to their imams. Well, you and I know that in this day and age, the last thing that young men do is be persuaded by the rantings of some aged priest. The real reason that these people are going off and fighting is because they have seen what the West is doing in these countries, and that has enraged them. So I would like to end on that note and just say once again that I hope that you will join with us when the vote comes around on the 18th of September and make sure that you vote yes. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Our last speaker tonight is Peter de Vink, a corporate financier who for 45 years was a unionist, then started to think there must be a better way than have Westminster lay down the law. Today he is an independent Midlothian councillor, and his swing vote ended 84 years, this is his word I take it, of disastrous Labour rule. Well done, Peter. In September he expects 300 years of unfortunate Westminster rule to come to a deserved end. Peter.
Thank you. Well, wonderful. Thank you all for coming. It's nice to see such a big crowd to be able to come on an evening like this, and it's very wonderful that I will be able to address you. I came to Scotland in 1963 after my national service in the Netherlands, and I came to read a degree at Edinburgh University and had expected to go back after 3 years. I would be well ahead of all my colleagues in the Netherlands who had been there at university for 7 or 8 years. But it wasn't to be, because I fell in love with Scotland. I really thought it was a fantastic country. It had hills and it had lots of wonderful people. And so I decided to stay on, and I have been a contributor both to the community and also to HMRC, that is the taxpayer. Anyway, I would like to just tell you a few interesting things. I've always, as the chairman explained, been a unionist. But it was not until George Osborne put this swinging taxation on North Sea oil about 4.5 years ago that I thought to myself, hey, hang on, this cannot be right. And I then started to look into it. And first of all, I discovered that, of course, 85% of all the oil was basically in Scottish waters. But the outcry was not so much from Scotland, it was from the oil industry. They really got so mad. And the result was that he had to withdraw it. It was a great climb down. Now, it's very interesting, when I started looking into it, the first thing I asked, now how much does Scotland contribute to HMRC, you know, the tax man? How much does Scotland produce? And it's on their website, you can get it there. 9.9% of all income taxes raised are coming from Scotland. Now don't say to me, oh yeah, that's because of oil, because Shell and Exxon and Chevron don't pay taxes in Scotland. They pay taxes either in Delaware or in London, but they don't pay it in Scotland. 9.9%. And we only have 8.4% of the population. So we actually contribute in Scotland 17% more than the average of the British contributor to our income taxes raised. That's quite a figure. And people are saying, oh, Scotland could never be independent, they couldn't afford it. That is a lot of baloney. They could easily afford it. Now, if we are going to be independent, and it is quite interesting, because as was said earlier, 307 years ago, when there was the Union of Parliaments, people said that was because of the Darien disaster. Nothing to do with the Darien. It did contribute a little, but what had happened, that in 1706, on the English statute book, was introduced the Alien Act. And what did that say? That if you were an alien, you could not own land in England. Oh my goodness, that was a shock. Because so many of the Scottish aristocracy, the Duke of Roxburgh, the Duke of Buccleuch, the Marquis of Lothian, they all had vast tracts of land that were in England. So they said, hey, hang on, we can't have that confiscated. We better join them. So there was a little cabal. And then a man called Dundas, from Arniston Estate, that's what he was given for his treacherous behaviour, then organised that there was the Union of Parliament. But none of the people in Scotland had a chance to vote. And we are going to have this wonderful chance on the 18th of September to vote. And whether we are going to vote yes or no, and I'm convinced that it will be yes, and it will be a significant yes, afterwards we all then have to get together and make the best of it. And we cannot then say, oh, he was staying. No, we all have to respect the opposite point of view, but we have to work to make that all work. Now, it's not going to be a walkover. And to say it will cost 200 billion, that is really nothing if you look at the total gross domestic product of Scotland. We will get much greater results from what's going to happen in the North Sea. I remember so vividly in 1973 that we were told by the oil industry that there was indeed oil in the North Sea, but that it would only last till about 1990, if we were very lucky, to the year 2000. Now they're saying, oh yeah, it will be 2030. I will guarantee you it will go to 2080. And I tell you why. To date, we have raised 40 billion barrels of oil. And that is up to now what we have got. The forecast is that we will have another 22 billion barrels that will still come out of the North Sea, but it will be a much bigger figure because here was even some. Can you imagine a drilling rig that costs that much money? Because on the west of the Shetland, there is still a huge oil province, and we will have oil for a long, long time to come. Now, I look at some of the other countries here in Europe that are very similar to Scotland. And there are 5 that are very, very, very similar. They all have 5 million people, roughly. There are Norway, they have 5 million. There is Finland, which has 5.2. There is Denmark, with 5.3. There is Switzerland, with 6.5. And there is Area, with 4.5. And we have 5.2. So those are countries that are really able to survive. They are doing all very well. And then I thought, well, let's look at these countries and find out how much is the GDP, the gross domestic product, per head of population. Norway, of course, was so fortunate that they had so much of the North Sea, and they had it only with 5 million people. We had all that with 60 million people. Norway has $100,000 per head of population. That is the income of each citizen in Norway. Then you have Switzerland, $85,000. Then comes Denmark with 60 million, Finland with 47, and Area, and so many people think Ireland is a basket case, 45,000. Now where are we at? We can't separate between Scotland and England, so you look at the UK. What is the average GDP, the GDP per head of population in the UK? A miserable $38,000. So that is almost a third of Norway, and half of Denmark. What are we doing? You know, we're not doing very well. And then I say to myself, well, how old can you become if you live in any of these countries? In Switzerland, you can become 85. In Denmark, Finland, and Norway, you can become 80. And in Ireland, it's 74. And now this time, you can actually work out the difference between England and Scotland. In England, you can become 78. But in Scotland, 70. And if you lived in the west of Scotland, it would be probably even less. Now, if we are going to do that bad, surely we are better off if we did it actually on our own. Now, it was very interesting. A few weeks ago, there was an article by the deputy principal of Glasgow University, and he is a no voter. He is also the professor of national health, not national health, but nation's health. And he had done a great deal of research, and he had found out, very surprisingly, that all those countries, and there are quite a lot of them, that became independent, the health of the nation very much improved. When the United Nations was started in 1947, there were 95 countries that were there to form the United Nations. Today, there are 195, and I hope that next year there will be 196 when Scotland will become independent. But isn't that interesting, that if you hear that such a large number of people became independent and joined the United Nations, that their health of these countries also improved. So that's something we can look forward to. Now, one of the things that I am very keen on is taxation. Well, I hate it, but I want it to be as low as possible. And one of the things that a lot of the countries that became independent did, they introduced the flat tax. That is a tax that is really, as it's expressed, a flat tax. Now, Eben knows a lot about that as the Taxpayers Alliance in Scotland. But I can tell you a few very interesting figures. In Great Britain today, there are 1.8 million people, can you believe it? 1.8 million people that are involved in the tax business. 900,000 work for HMRC, that's the tax man. The other, and they are trying to collect as much as possible, the other 900,000 work for banks, insurance companies, accountants, lawyers, and IFAs. And they are trying to make sure that you pay as little tax as possible. So 1.8 million people are doing a very destructive, unproductive job. They're doing something that really should be done by a handful of people. Now, you can hardly believe it, that 1.8 million people. We want to introduce, in an independent Scotland, and I'll come back later how we think we can do that, a flat tax. And you would pay no more than 15% tax. But if you earned less than £16,000, at the moment it's less than 10,000, you don't pay any tax. With us, our formula, it will be £16,000, you don't pay any tax. What a vote winner. That's why we are going to sell it to Alex Salmond in due course. But it is, what you then do, you get no allowances, so you're not allowed to write off anything, no depreciation. You pay 15% income tax. If you make £1 million and £16,000, you pay 150,000. Not as it is today, 450,000. So a third less. If you VAT 50%, all of that, and we have put this through a computer, and we could, in 3 years' time, actually break even then, and then start doing a lot better. Because the people that have so much more money, will start employing people, and there will be an enormous multiple effect. But most importantly, we could do that with probably 20,000 people. If you think 1.8 million people, Scotland 8.4% of the population. So what is that? 160,000 people. We could do it really with 20,000. And the other 140,000 can do something that would be really productive and good. Now, I hope that I'm not overstaying the welcome. They were originally, it was mentioned, the importance of having a seat at the top table. I don't know how many of you are from the rural community, but you will know CAP, the Community Agricultural Policy. At the moment, we have Finland gets 5 times what Scotland gets, and Ireland gets 4 times what Scotland gets. If we had a seat in Brussels at the top table, we would have been able to negotiate a very much better deal than we are getting today. Because all the money goes to Westminster, and then it gets distributed, and who gets the bulk of the money? The farmers in Lincolnshire, who are doing so very well. And all our rural farmers here in Scotland are getting a pittance, and that is so wrong. And there are so many other examples that I can give you, that if you have a seat at the top table, how much more important that is, because you can really influence things. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of the Oslo Agreement. The Oslo Agreement was in 1980, and I don't know whether you recall, but in those days there were all the conflicts, and they used a lot of cluster bombs. And there was one nation with 3.5 million people who had a seat at the top table in the United Nations, and they moved that there would be a ban on cluster bombs. And they were given the task to do it, but they were all the way down under, it was New Zealand, 3.5 million people. But they fought it very tooth and nail. And since 1980, until just Mr. Syria very recently, there hasn't been a cluster bomb made or a cluster bomb thrown. And that was the making of one tiny nation who had a seat at the top table. Scotland, who has had a nation of such wonderful people. We were earlier talking about Adam Smith. You had David Hume, you had Rabbie Burns. They were all philosophers or writers. But then we had Andrew Carnegie. He was a Scot, and he has given away more money than even Bill Gates has ever managed to give away. Then there was Alexander Bell, who invented the telephone. Logie Baird, who's the television. Paraffin Young, Alexander Fleming was the penicillin. We have had all these fantastic Scots, and they've been all over the nation. And then we are saying we couldn't run our own affairs. How is it possible that anyone would have a doubt that we in Scotland couldn't run our own affairs? So here we go. We are going to be often accused that if we were so big and we had the Bank of Scotland or the Royal Bank of Scotland going bust, we couldn't have managed. Well, I've got a surprise for you. I don't know whether you realize, but none of the Canadian banks went bust. Or none of the Canadian banks had to borrow money. They all stayed. Now, all the 4 Canadian banks were funded and started by Scottish people. Scotsmen that went out to Canada and who founded the very famous Canadian banks that we have today. And those banks worked on a very cautious process. And they didn't borrow, and they didn't really do all these crazy things that the Royal Bank did. Not in Scotland, but in America or in London. And so we would have ourselves a proper system where we would control these banks. I'm almost finished. One of the things that I most like, if we would become independent, is that we will be able to remove one enormous layer of administration. one great bureaucratic layer will be cut out. It's called Westminster. We will have no more Westminster. We will have simply the councils, Hollywood, and ultimately, of course, Brussels. But we will be able to run our affairs so much better. So, when the 18th of September comes, do not think of fear. Think of all the great opportunities we in Scotland will have. And I will be then the very first one on the 20th of September to rush off and get myself a Scottish passport. Thank you.
Thank you very much, panel. Now on to what is arguably the most important part of this evening, which is actually questions. You've heard some different perspectives tonight. You've not heard the word socialism used, other than in a desire for a different kind of approach. You've heard really about what this is about. It's about us deciding our own future. We determine our future, nobody else. So I want to open it to the floor, and we'd then like to put their hands up, and Nigel will go down and pick up any forms that people would like to hand in, and we'll carry on. Yes, thank you.
I'll stand up as well. It was going right at the beginning, Mr. Fry, maybe picking up on the socialism point. From what I understood, your desire would be to have as little intervention from the government and as small a government as possible. But then you brought in Adam Smith, who is the father of capitalism, but also competition law. You made a reference to the fact that those merchants who have the money do their best to get as much money out of their customers. The way to protect the people from people with money trying to get more money just for them is in effect by government intervention. I'm here to the current day where we have the OST or the Competition Commission or Ofgem or etc. These are extensions of the government who are there to, as I say, protect the average person, the consumer. So I'm just wondering how you see it as being in an independent Scotland where we have all the levers of power, but we decide to take away government powers, reduce it to as little as possible, and yet we, the people, so to speak, are still protected from the greed that we know exists and we know will exist.
Well, I think the capitalist system runs basically through competition, and the way to eliminate bad practice and to get the best deal for the consumers in a capitalist society is through competition. I mean, I would say that the great crisis through which we have lived in the last 5 years is not because of competition, it's because of a lack of competition. It is because under the last Labour government, such enormous privileges and advantages were extended to certain portions of the system, notably the banking system, that these people were enabled to rip the rest of us off, essentially. So, I mean, there have been a number of impressive books out lately about the fall of the Royal Bank of Scotland in particular. I mean, I'd recommend especially the one by my friend and colleague Ian Fraser, which goes through, line by line everything that happened and showed that in the end, the Royal Bank of Scotland was not serving the public. Actually, it was treating the public as a milch cow to be exploited by the sharp practices of bankers. Now, I would say in the capitalist system we need a level playing field. We need the rules to be the same for everybody, and they should be simple rules. They should be transparent rules that we can all understand. Just as the tax system should be simple and transparent, so we can't have tax fiddles the whole time. So our commercial policy, our regulatory policy should be such as to be as simple and as transparent as possible. And then I think we can rely on competition to keep things on an even keel. I mean, this was how things worked in Victorian Britain and in Victorian Scotland before the state started intervening on a big scale in the 20th century. People made, of course, large fortunes in Victorian Scotland, especially. But these fortunes arose not through the manipulation of politics. There was in those days a very strict demarcation between the economy and the political system. People became millionaires, like Andrew Carnegie, who was mentioned before, because they ran companies which supplied what the economy wanted. In Carnegie's case, the steel corporations, and so you didn't have this collusion between business and government, which allowed them to exploit the electorate and the public. I mean, we believe that the fewer and simpler the rules, the better you can maintain competition and stop the exploitation of the ordinary citizen by a combination of capitalists, an unholy alliance of capitalists and politicians.
Then we'll go on to that. Okay, I'll take one of these written questions and then I'll go back to the floor. Do you think a federal UK is actually a good thing?
Could I do that?
Yes, you said.
A federal UK is really neither fish nor fowl. I always think, whenever I hear about Devo Max, and it's very interesting that the Conservative leader told us there would be a line in the sand, and there would be no more allowance that Edinburgh or Hollywood would get any more powers. Now they are suddenly giving more powers. But I am saying always, sadly, you cannot be half pregnant. If you could, that would be wonderful, but unfortunately you can't. And it's either that you have everything and you are in charge of your own destiny, than rather than having a federal solution.
Could I just add one thing to that? I think that what rules it out in practical terms is the fact that the 85% of the population of England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland is in England. And you couldn't possibly have a federal arrangement in which the English would allow, I wouldn't if I was English, that their political wishes should be overruled by the other 15%.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes people will try to get around this by saying, well, we'll break up England into different regions, and so we'll have a federation of Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and each of 9 or 10 English regions. Well, okay, but that would leave us in the same position we're in now. So I just don't think that for practical purposes there's any realistic option of a federal solution.
Does anyone want to ask? Put their hands up. Yes, sir. Go to gentlemen.
Well, I have a question which has worried me for a long time, which is no one, whether it's in Brussels or NATO, is going to give us an easy ride. There is going to be some very hard bargaining, I think. Sure. And I doubt, I find myself in a position of wondering whether, in fact, by leaving Westminster and looking to Brussels, we're just jumping from the devil to the deep blue sea. And I would be interested to hear your reaction to it if you wish to answer.
Well, I would say that, I mean, you raised two questions, about NATO and about... you raised two questions about NATO and about Brussels. Well, with NATO, I just can't see any problem at all. I mean, we're fully entitled to be a member of NATO. There's no reason to exclude us. We'd be willing members of the Western Alliance, and I know of no rule or no policy of NATO which which would try to keep us out. The question about Europe is obviously a more complex one altogether. The problem is that there is no European law on this because it will never have happened before. It's never happened that one state has seceded from another state, from an existing member state, and so we don't know exactly what's going to happen because there are no rules to follow. What usually happens in these circumstances, in analogous circumstances, is that the Council of Ministers of the European Union, which is the legislature, I mean it is the ultimate authority, simply decides what's going to happen. You can't ask the European Courts of Justice to apply a law which doesn't exist. You can make all kinds of deductions about what happened to Greenland and so on and so forth, deductions from existing corpus of law, but the law is basically not there, so we can the European Union is entitled to legislate, if it so wishes, to admit Scotland as a new member state, or it can also legislate to admit us or to continue, assume we are a continuing state. I would say that, assuming Scotland does vote yes on September the 18th, everyone will want to resolve this problem as quickly and as cleanly as possible. And in that case, I think Scotland will find its entry to the European Union quite quick and easy. I mean, Professor James Crawford of Cambridge University, who is apparently the world's greatest expert on these things, and I'm prepared to accept that and leave the whole question to him, said he thought it could easily be done in the 18 months between the referendum on September the 18th and the prospective Independence Day in 2016. So I think, despite all the bluster, I think once the decision is taken, it's for us to take the decision to vote yes, and then I think everyone will wish to welcome and to make the assumption by this new democratic, prosperous country, make the assumption of its membership in the European Union as easy as possible.
Thank you. Actually, sir, if you speak to the gentleman in front of you, I know because he lives in Cllr, he is a European lawyer. So if you want an expert opinion, not that yours is not expert, Michael, thank you. The gentleman here.
As the Speaker said, it's a huge decision that the country is making. It's a huge decision that the country is making.
Absolutely.
And I would feel happier about it, I mean, as a neutral Englishman living in Scotland, if it had the overwhelming support of the people in Scotland. But we have to be realistic. The polls are against the yes vote, and it's consistently been so for 18 months and haven't shifted a great deal. So my question is, how big a mandate does Scotland think it needs in order to make this big step and negotiate with people who will be hostile, including the English, which will have to agree a currency, etc., etc.?
Okay.
Is 51% enough, or do you feel uncomfortable about that?
Okay. Peter's desperate to answer this one.
The last time, in 1978, when there was a referendum of some sort, the yes vote won by 51%, but there was the regulation that we had to have 52, and then we were promised that we would have devolution. And the most decent of prime ministers that Britain has ever had, Alex Douglas Hume, promised us that we would get devolution. Well, it took 20 years before we finally got that. And I agree with you that it would be much better if, in the end of the day, the election, the result would be 55% yes or 55% no. That there is a good difference. But in the end of the day, you have to rely on the fact that it is even one vote. I personally feel that although the polls are saying it's not going to work, the polls have been quite wrong in the past. And I don't know whether you recall, but at the last election of Alex Salmond, up to a fortnight before the election, he was bound to lose and certainly, you know, it was felt that Labour would be the largest party. And in 2 weeks' time, it all turned round. Now, in Britain, well, certainly in Scotland, 30% of all people will always vote for independence. Even if it's a total disaster, they will still want to be Scotland independent. And the other 30% will always want the Union, even if it quite clearly, as I have proven earlier today when I spoke, a total unfair formula. But they will still back it. Those 60% are really all voting with their hearts. And the other 40%, and I hope several of you will be amongst them, they are all going to vote with what's between the ears. And that is how it should be. And I'm quite convinced, my guess is that we will actually have a yes vote with a quite overwhelming majority. I would say between 55 and 60. And I'm willing to take bets on it.
Can I just add before I read out the next question, one of the things I'd ask you to remember here and contrast is the turnouts we get, the level of disenfranchisement and disengagement people have in UK politics today, the pathetic level of turnout that we normally experience. The forecast is, and let's see what happens, that this is going to be 80%. So 50% of 80% is significantly more than anybody else has ever received to run a government in this country. And I think it's fair, it's self-determination. It may feel nervous if it's that close, but I'm confident that it will be a significant yes.
I think it's very interesting for economists to hear people sloganeering about inequality, because we are pariahs when we start talking about inequality. Equality as a concept to an economist is meaningless, as is freedom. There are meaningless concepts. Allowing freedom is a good concept because it means an action. Equalization is what people mean when they talk about equality. And what we try and point out in Wealthy Nation is that if you attempt equalization, it has consequences. And the consequences of trying equalization, where you have too much taxation or regulation or some other measure, can be less prosperity, not more. So we take the view, like many liberal economists, that the point is to try and make the wealth grow. So the whole shit goes up. We get a bigger cake. And then we start talking about how we distribute that. So the point about our side, if you like, of the argument, is we're not against people talking about equality, because we know they're talking about equalization, but we don't want to engage too much in that argument, because we'll start talking about food banks in Glasgow and all the things that come from welfare policy and the rest of it, and bedroom tax. We'd rather have all those people back at work and doing things and making money for themselves and being self-reliant. So that's where we stand on equality. Make the cake bigger.
Okay, thank you. So this is a good one. People say there's not enough information in the referendum debate. I think we all know it's the complete opposite. There's too much information and it does not correlate. So this question here, Danny Alexander quotes 2.7 billion as a startup cost, whereas Mr. Swinney quotes 200 million. What are we expected to believe? And why are the figures at such variance? I think we need an economist, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, I really don't know how Danny Alexander got his figure. He, I think, has been rather reticent to say, although, as I said, the number of 2.7 billion in the Treasury paper was referenced with a source to this Professor Dunleavy. And no sooner had this been published than said professor got on the airwaves with his tweeting or twittering to say that this, and I quote the exact words, bizarrely inaccurate, and that he would be more likely to go for a number of 200 million, in other words, about 12 times less than that. Now, how can you account for this huge discrepancy? And I think the answer is this, that the 200 million refers to the cost of setting up institutions which clearly don't exist in Scotland at the moment. Let's say the Foreign Office is a good example. There's no counterpart in Scotland. Then the question arises, what about things that do occur in Scotland, like energy, the operation of gas, electricity, water companies, or what about other common services like telecommunications? How do we change these if we want to change them at all? The obvious answer, if we think about it for a moment, is, well, it depends on how much you want to change them. For example, the Scottish government basically suggested that the arrangement for energy and markets should stay much the same. There should be the UK national grid should continue as before. And the only difference would be having some Scottish government representatives on the controlling board. Just in the same way with the currency union. The Scottish government has proposed that pound sterling should continue to be used. And that the only difference would be that on the regulatory bodies, including the Bank of England, there should be a Scottish government representative. Now, to what extent either of these positions would actually happen is a matter for political negotiation between a yes vote and the actual beginning of independence. And therefore you could see why the government the Scottish government has been very reluctant to try and put a number on the costs of making these adjustments, because we don't know if, for example, the energy market was to continue, if the currency arrangements continue, which, by the way, I think I put my pension on it that they will, then the cost would be negligible. If, on the other hand, you had set up your own energy system, your own currency system, they might be fairly significant. But anyway, these secondary costs, as I would call them, of adjusting or gradually changing the existing system to a more Scottish one, would take place over maybe 10 years. And they would involve replacing IT systems, which might be quite expensive. But in any case, to come back to Peter's point, if we wanted to have our own separate tax administration, which most people would think would be desirable because I think everyone agrees that HMRC is not making a very good job of it, then we might take the opportunity of becoming more independent to introduce totally different tax systems, both IT systems and tax systems different in principle, such as a flat tax. But in any case, as I say, beyond the actual 200 million which would be required to set up functions which don't exist at the moment, the additional cost of adapting existing functions to make them more Scottish and less UK would depend entirely on what the outcome of negotiations after the yes vote between Scotland and the UK government would be. But in any case, the Professor Dunleavy had another intervention which I saw reported in the Scotsman today, in which he puts the upper limit for these additional costs over 10 years of adjusting to a purely Scottish system of somewhere about 1.7 billion. The lower end of his range is about 500 billion, I think. Nowhere near Danny Alexander's number. And so if you want to know where he got the number from, you must ask the Treasury and ask where they got it from. They clearly are embarrassed because they say they will admit they have misbriefed. The source they cited is clearly disavowed them, and even more embarrassing, once that disavowal had been made public, they kind of coughed and said, well, actually, we've got another study, if you don't like this one, my professor in Quebec, who has come up with a slightly lower figure, but still bigger than John Swinney's number. However, that was immediately provoked another disavowal from the Professor Young in Quebec. So I'm afraid to say that I don't think there is any substance in Danny Alexander's number. I think he just got a special advisor to think of a number that would be sufficiently frightening that the media could splash it on their front pages, as they surely did.
Thank you. I'll take the next question from the floor, please. Gentleman here.
While accepting sharing the ballot box with Wealthy Nation, I'm a bit scared by this sort of promotion of Victorian values and returning to a Victorian society. The specific question is that you seem to be implying that we have a low tax, small government, independent Scotland, which will replicate exactly what's happening in England at the moment, which is the destruction of the welfare state, the destruction of the NHS, the privatisation of the NHS, probation service, heaven knows what. This isn't happening in Scotland at the moment. How do you propose that what I see as very valuable services be maintained in Scotland?
Okay, thank you. Can I just add to that, because it does correlate to one of the questions here. What would Adam Smith have thought of the NHS in Scotland, and how would Wealthy Nation wish its future to be?
Could I go first?
Yes, certainly,
yeah.
Of course.
If I could take the first question first about the role of low taxes in an independent Scotland. There is one truth pattern, I might say, which I think is universally supported by history, and that is this, that if you want to have a flourishing economy, and by that I mean a steadily and rapidly growing economy, then you have to have tax rates which are selectively low on certain kinds of taxes, and I mean by that corporation taxes and taxes of people who are producers of wealth, low enough that the resulting tax revenues will be higher than they would be if you had higher tax rates. You've got to distinguish between the rate of a tax, do you pay 20%, 30%, 10%, and the resulting revenue. And you will notice that all through the Western world in the last 10, 20 years, corporation tax have been drifting, corporation tax rates have been drifting down until they come near to the Irish level of 12%. Now the whole point about that is that if you have a low corporate tax rate, you hope to attract industry which will create more employment and will, through its increased output, increase more revenues. Now what does this got to do with the health service and the public sector? The answer is even more simple, and that is this, that there is only, you will be aware that both in Scotland and in England, the health service is under severe strain. That the demands on the health service, which come about from, partly from ageing, partly from our own bad behaviour, that we eat too many of the wrong kinds of things.
Drink too much.
You know, Peter maybe willing to be an example of that. And the third thing is the fact that we're all living longer, and the increasing cost of technology. All of these things are driving steadily up the costs of running health service, both in Scotland and everywhere as well. How can you do that? The only way you can pay for that is through tax revenues. There's no other way. You could say, well, let's borrow the money, but you still have to pay that back in the future by tax revenues, as the present government and the previous one found out. So the only way that you can support health service, education service, pensions, public sector, is by generating increasing tax revenues. And the only way you can do that is by having a flourishing economy. And the only way you can have a flourishing economy is by having selectively low tax rates.
Can I pick up on that? Because I think the gentleman is keen, and the ripple around of we want to keep our, let's call them collectivised public services. It's actually not for us to answer that from the observational evidence point of view. It's actually for the left to answer that question. Because when you look at it from our point of view, the reality of centralised, nationalised, completely tax-funded public services is not good. That's a purely objective remark. They run out of money. The coal industry ran out of money. The steel industry ran out of money. The public telephone thing ran out of money. The commanding heights was a failure. Economists have looked at this and consider that the centralised public service, fully funded by tax funding, is not working. That does not mean that we, as liberal economists, want to privatise it all. There are possibly other ways. We might have mutuals, we might have various other arrangements, institutional arrangements, but that won't be central. I'll give you a fact. In Chile, which you probably don't think of as a developed country, if you retire as a worker today, you retire on 75% of your salary. Now that is because they took their pension system and they funded it beginning in 1982. They now have so much money in the bank they can afford their old people. We didn't do that. We borrowed the money. As David has pointed out, over the years, we have ended up paying more interest on our debt than our own defence programme, and all that money can't be spent on health, can't be spent on education. It's all going straight out the windows of rich people in Switzerland and bankers. We made a mistake by going for the centrally nationalised method. I'm not saying to go for privatisation. I'm saying we should not retain the central nationalisation of public services. I can give you an answer. It took me too long to explain how we might do it. But the answer to your question, sir, is not that we have to say what we should do. The people who want fully public services now have to explain how to deal with 47% of government taking away too much tax from those who create the wealth.
And the report last week said the NHS is the most efficient health provider out of 12 advanced industrialised countries.
Indeed it was. It rations medical care extremely effectively.
It also suggests that none of them ran out of money quite as brilliantly as the banks.
Yes, they certainly do. Yeah. True.
Okay, and would anyone else like to ask a question? If no one else puts their hand up, sir, I will allow you a second question. Go on then.
The second question. I've heard several visions of a new independent Scotland, and no doubt as we're meeting here tonight, there are two meetings going on in the west of Scotland, one by Tommy Sheridan and the other by Jim Sillars, who are arguing for an independent Scotland with a completely different vision. Now, how do you square that?
Yeah, good point. Good point.
What will happen after the election?
Oh, sorry.
I'll come to you next, sir, yeah. Or you want to answer that?
Just a question on this hasn't actually been addressed at all by I think when it comes to vote, basically we're going to vote along national lines. And there is something called Britain that hasn't actually been referred to at all tonight. And I think the British element is probably going to be very important when it comes to the vote. And a lot of people, maybe I don't know how this room regards, but probably a lot of people consider themselves British rather than Scottish, particularly those English birth. I've seen you shake your head.
Well, I'm just purely based on statistics, sir. If you look at the statistics, it is true in the borders there's a higher number who correlate as both, and it is a factor. But sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. If you want to continue.
I think the point we're making is that it's not a question of economics entirely. Economists never agree about anything, at least all your power. There are, when we get into the booths on the 18th, I think a lot of us will be influenced largely by our vision of the country as a whole. And I'm not talking just about Scotland, I'm talking about the United Kingdom. For some reason, that's really escaped the notice of your Dennis.
Okay. There was 2 points. So I'll put your point about identity to the panel, and then the gentleman as well, if we can intertwine as well, the fact that there is, in the west of Scotland, 2 meetings and a different view of Scotland. Who would like to?
Yeah.
On
the first issue, the Yes campaign is a very broad church. It has on the one hand Colin Fox, the best man of Mr. What does he called? Tommy Sheridan.
They're not speaking terms.
And on the other hand, the 4 of us. You know, there is a very broad church. But in the end of the day, what we all want is to have the best for Scotland. Now, coming back on Mr. Seymour's issue of the British connection, I am quite sure that once Scotland becomes independent, that it will be joined at the hip with the rest of the United Kingdom. And I always feel that Scotland, which is currently a very surly lodger as far as the rest of the United Kingdom is concerned, will become a very, very contented and good neighbour. And that's how I see it.
Fraser is an old friend of mine, because I used to be a member of the Conservative Party, and I was been a Conservative candidate both for Westminster and for Holyrood. And Fraser this week gave a very good speech about a new vision which he hoped would solve the constitutional problem for the United Kingdom. Now, I think we have been talking about the constitutional problem in Scotland for the last 30 or 40 years. And I don't think any of us are in doubt about what the constitutional problem of the United Kingdom is. The increasing remoteness of a political class, in cahoots with media moguls of various kinds, who carry on the public life of the country with scarcely any reference to the ordinary voters. And even, you would think, relatively simple tasks, such as reforming the House of Lords, for example. The House of Lords, now essentially a legislative body appointed by the government of the day, is an absolute scandal. I mean, no other country in the world would dream of having an upper house of the legislature selected in the way that we have. And although we have been trying to reform the House of Lords for as long as anyone can remember, we still haven't arrived at a satisfactory form of it. At Westminster, at the centre of the United Kingdom, there is absolutely no thinking of any kind about comprehensive constitutional reform. No party has even begun to think about it. We tend to lose sight of this because we thought so much about it, and we have so many ideas about it, and we spend whole evenings arguing about it. Nobody at Westminster does this. They simply accept that the Westminster system is going to carry on as it is, while the country's international standing declines, while when its Prime Minister goes to European summits, he's completely isolated and powerless. I mean, there is something very deeply wrong with the United Kingdom, and most of the United Kingdom, above all its political establishment, simply doesn't recognise it and realise it. I would say we have a great advantage in Scotland in that we do see what is wrong, and we also have the instruments, the means of changing it in our hands. And I hope on September the 18th we'll use that instrument.
If I can just add a little bit to that, sir. To me, this is not about identity. I think it's been said by several speakers. It's about where power lies and who votes for your government and what that government considers when it makes policy. Voting yes, being independent, does not erase 300 years of shared history. It doesn't change our values, it doesn't change our connections, with people, no matter their identity. Here we have a man born in a different country, but he considers himself a Scot. It doesn't make him any less Dutch that he feels that way. It's not about identity. And if people do vote though, sir, along the lines you're suggesting, actually social attitude surveys, if anyone wants to correct me if I'm wrong, show more and more people in this country identify themselves as Scottish, not British. And it's actually going in the opposite direction for whatever reason. And I actually think part of the reason is a disconnection with institutions, as Michael has just outlined. I've got one question here, which actually takes it to a completely different area that we haven't touched on yet. In the event of a yes vote, what mechanism will be in place to allow the written People's Constitution to avoid a parliamentarian, the great and the good, pushing the small person, having their views, ideas discussed? Okay, so how do we make sure it truly is a People's Constitution?
Well,
I think it has to be the historian there.
Yeah, we've actually been writing a constitution ourselves, so but I'll spare you the wonderful details. Well, the intention is that after independence, a constitutional convention should be called. As other, I mean, the most famous constitutional convention was the one that drew up the Constitution of the United States in 1787. And the numerous other countries have followed this example, and some countries revise their constitution every so often in the light of changing circumstances. I mean, we've been living under a British system where there's no constitution, and where every government that has a parliamentary majority is just free to change the constitution as it wishes, without reference to previous constitutional practice. And without relying on anything but its parliamentary majority, which of course will often rest on a minority of the electorate. In Scotland, I'm glad to say, because we can just do everything from the beginning. We start afresh. We can think about things and do things right. So a constitutional convention will be called, and the First Minister has already said, and I think it's commendable, that this constitutional convention will, for example, not simply replicate the membership of the Scottish Parliament, so the government of the day need not necessarily dominate that constitutional convention and get through what it likes. So presumably, I mean, the details have not been announced. So presumably there will be representatives from various sections of civil society, the trade unions, the professions, and so on and so forth. And I think it'd be wise, it's the right thing to do in these circumstances, to try to construct a convention which is as widely representative of Scottish society as possible. And I'm sure then in those circumstances, that convention will come to the conclusions that similar bodies have come to, that the future of the Constitution, the future of Scotland should have a Constitution which has, for example, a separation of powers, so that the government of the day cannot simply overrule the judiciary or the executive can't completely control the legislature, and so on and so on. So you have a system of checks and balances which ensure the rights enshrined in the Constitution, the human rights enshrined in the Constitution, and which cannot be subject to the arbitrary actions of government in the way that the British Constitution at present allows. Okay, there's a supplement to that.
Yes, sir.
I wonder if I could just add to that. In fact, it's quite possible to look at the existing plans for the Constitutional Convention. If anybody wishes, they can go on to the Scottish Government's website, and the draft bill for the interim constitution is there in full. And among other things, it lays down very, very explicitly that the membership of the convention must be independent not only of the Scottish Parliament but of the governing party. And the quality of the paper, interestingly, interestingly, has been commented on by probably the most foremost academic unit that deals with constitutional issues in the United Kingdom, namely the Constitutional Forum of University College London, which wrote a paper on the draft bill just this last week. It was published, and it praises it in quite impressive terms for the clarity and the clarity of it and the honesty of its purpose. So it is something that anybody here can look up on the net, both the original draft bill and I would recommend the learned commentary from the University College London Constitutional Forum.
Okay, thank you.
I think one thing
Yes,
about that.
yes.
I think one of the most interesting things when you come to the meetings like this, and we heard the word the small man or the little man in the question, the original question. When you have the division of powers, and I think that's something that will be brought in, because Scotland's like that, we like to feel, and the American experience, actually, there was a man called James Alexander Wilson who half wrote the damn thing. He came from Cooper and Fife. When we start looking at constitutional issues in the Scottish context, where the people are sovereign, I think we have a very good chance of bringing up a truly radical, people-driven elective constitution where we have the separation of powers plus localism built in to a new Scottish constitution. That would be a revolution in the modern world and would help greatly to make this nation very wealthy.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Yes.
One of the things that we don't talk about much in this debate is the impact on England, or Lesser Britain, as we might be calling it. What effect do you think a yes vote in Scotland would have on the English economy? There's all this discussion about how Scottish oil is actually underpinning sterling, and if we separate, what impact do you think it will have on the English economy?
Well, my view, which may not be shared by everyone else on the panel or anyone else in this room, is that it would make very little difference at all, simply because the important thing that matters, trade, will continue as before, and the cross-border flows of investment will continue as before. So I can't think of any reason why it should have any adverse impact on the English economy. In fact, one would hope that if all the things we've been talking about, or even some of them, come to pass, so that the underperformance of the Scottish economy is reversed and it begins to grow more rapidly, that would have obviously spin-off effects, trickle-down effects to England. But you mustn't forget that England is so much bigger, 12 times in terms of population, that it would be most unlikely that there would be any perceptible effects, either positive or negative, but one would hope that in the long run it would be positive. Certainly, when Ireland left in 1922, I've not read anywhere that anybody thought that there was any noticeable consequence.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? I do have a question here, which is area much raised actually in the debate, and someone has asked for your perspective or plan for Trident, nuclear deterrent.
Yeah. Now, Trident is a Cold War machine that was created in the days that we had the Iron Curtain, and it was probably a very useful thing at the time. Now, if you think, Great Britain is the 5th largest contributor to defense spending in the world, the 5th largest. And our enormous budget for defense, which is about 5.9% of our GDP, that enormous budget, almost a third is in the cost of having the 3 giant, multi-billion submarines all sailing underneath the seas around the world. And then, if we wanted to actually fire a missile, We couldn't do it because we have to get permission from Uncle Sam. Now, I love Uncle Sam, but let him pay for it, and then we don't have to pay for it. But the worst thing is, and this is the best thing that would happen, I believe passionately, that independence is not just good for Scotland, it's also good for England, because in the end of the day, we will stop Trident, which is a stupid and crazy thing. And I don't understand how that great British system of administration could actually build 2 giant aircraft carriers that can't take aircraft. I mean, how is it possible? How can a nation as successful as the United Kingdom actually get their act so badly together that they build 2 giant aircraft carriers that cannot take aircraft? And Trident is exactly the same. Let's kiss Trident goodbye. It will be great for England if they get rid of it, and it would be great for Scotland. Trident is a Cold War machine.
Thank you. Last chance for anybody to ask a question. Yes, sir.
We haven't heard anything yet about Scotland's relationship with the rest of the world in an independent Scotland scenario. Probably everybody in this room knows that the population of Scotland is actually half that of Greater London now. Yet the diaspora, people who feel they are Scottish around the world, numbers between 85 and 90 million. They're not obviously being consulted on this vote, but that's the number of people around the world, as far away as New Zealand, who feel Scottish. I'd like to hear a little bit about what you all feel Scotland's role will be in relating to all those people and exercising on behalf of Scotland a leadership role in connecting with those people who feel so Scottish, and whether that is a responsibility that Scotland should take on.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I don't. I'm personally in favour of Scotland, an independent Scotland, abandoning any pretensions to any kind of imperial role of the kind that England has, or Britain has, the United Kingdom has tried to pursue long beyond its capacity to do so. I think the role of Scotland is as a modest but prosperous country which can join in international organisations and join with other countries of similar size in order to spread our liberal and democratic values around the world. This need not be in a military sense. I mean, I think we stay in NATO and make our contribution, but it would be, if you like, in a moral and an intellectual sense. You know, Scotland, man for man, and indeed woman for woman, has probably done more to create the modern world than any other single nation. And I think it's that more humane tradition that we should call on and try to develop, rather than looking back to our imperial past.
Can I take an entrepreneurial view of what is useful about having? My figure was 12 million Scots, but every time you go and ask somebody who's very Scottish, it gets bigger and bigger. Alex Salmon told us a story that in America they had a survey in which 25 million Americans declared that they were Scottish, but then when asked, would you like to have allegiance with Scotland, 37 million said they would do that, so who knows. From an entrepreneurial point of view, in a world of free trade, the brand Scotland, I'm not talking about whiskey here, I'm talking about our character, and the ability to bring Scottish know-how, good go and the rest of it to Scotland, we can make a lot of that. I'd like to see businesses sending young managers with rucksacks on their back to China. I'd like them to be wandering around there. I'd like us to be in Malaya, I'd like to be all over the place, meeting other Scots, coming back to Glasgow or Ayrshire and saying, this place is run down because we're not making this, we can make this, let's go and do it. It's the way you can do things. We should be doing a lot of networking in our business community, which is effectively what I did in my life. I made 3 businesses out of America, out of Europe, and out of England. And we can do it if we get on with it.
Okay, good, thank you.
Well, could I just add one small
Yes,
thing?
you can. We're about to close, so you're just in time.
I think the question maybe had in mind the possibility of exploiting the Scottish diaspora for business connections, contacts. And I was trying to think of any parallels to that. And of course, again, you come back to the example of Ireland, who proverbially had a very much huge diaspora in relation to the remaining domestic population. And the question I asked myself, have the Irish Economic Development Authorities used this in any way, whether in marketing Irish goods or in trying to attract inward investment? And the honest answer is I don't know. But it does seem to me that they must at least offer a prospect. Because as Eben said, networking is the most important thing in marketing and business. And if you have an initial contact, if you've got something to get your foot in the door, that surely must be a help.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, can I thank you again for all coming along tonight? It's a Friday evening. I think this debate tonight should remind us all, despite differing perspectives in the room, we can have a mature, a sensible, a grown-up debate, and no matter what happens on the 18th of September, we all have the interests of the people that live in this country at heart. Can I remind you of some future events that are coming up on the 29th of July? Sir, we're going to do exactly what you were referring to, but in Peebles. We're going to have Patrick Harvey, who I dare say may have a slightly different perspective on the Green Party. And I think it's the 12th of August, and in the lead-in, Leslie Ruddock is going to be giving a talk about her book. We will have Business for Scotland, and we will have Women for Independence along as well. There are pieces of information here. If anyone's a Yes supporter and would like to put a Yes up in their window or a badge, or if you would like more information or to give us feedback on what you'd like to see in future, we would love to receive that as well. If you would care to give a small donation to help pay for our costs, that would be greatly received as well. But let me just close with one point, which is that government is like life. You choose your priorities. There is diversity in the debate because different people have different priorities. But as almost every member of the panel said in their opening remarks tonight, with a yes vote, we decide the government we get, we always get the government we vote for, and we choose the kind of society in Scotland we want to live in. Thank you very much for coming along tonight, and thank you in particular to our panel. Thank you.